Upstate New York was generally cold on Christmas Eve, but the cold was particularly intense that year. The quiet in our automobile as we drew into his parents' driveway was more significant than the snow pile on our doorstep or the chilly wind that crept through the windows. I told myself it was simply the cold, but my hands were shaking a little under the foil as I cradled the casserole dish on my lap. I looked at my 7-year spouse, Ethan, seeking some consolation. A grin. I squeezed my hand. Something. However, he simply gazed straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel and his jaw clenched. All morning, he had only exchanged a few words with me. I accompanied him up the stairs when we left, seeming more like a visitor than a wife. He was not waiting on me. He wasn't holding the door open. The smell of ham and cinnamon wafted in, mingling with his family's laughter. I inhaled and intervened. "Ethan!" His mother put her arms around him and smiled. "At last! Everyone has already arrived." Apparently, everyone except me. She gave me a fleeting glance. As if I were a waiter at a catered event, I stood clumsily in the foyer with the casserole in my hand until his younger sister passed by and took it from me silently. I made an effort to ignore it. I always did. I kept telling myself that they simply needed time during the first few years of our marriage. Despite not being one of them yet, I knew that I would eventually become one, that they would eventually make room for me if I offered to help with the dishes, brought the appropriate wine, and laughed at their jokes. However, that illusion would be dispelled this Christmas. As soon as we assembled in the opulent dining room, I noticed that the long mahogany table had 12 chairs. I had 2 counts, 13 people and 12 seats. At the top, Ethan's mother seated everyone with care, almost ceremonially. "You sit here, Nicole and Daniel. You sit next to me, Dad. Naturally, Ethan is beside you." Next, the cousins. My heart started pounding. She continued to assign seats and fill the chairs until only one name remained to be called. Mine. No chair, though. "Oh, sorry, Ava," she replied nonchalantly as she finally turned to face me. "We were unaware of your arrival. However, if you want to eat there is a stool beside the kitchen counter." The room seemed to pause. Ethan shifted uneasily, but I remained silent. Nobody spoke. The borders of my vision became blurry. I started to speak, to stress that there must have been an error, that they must have forgotten, or perhaps someone could come over, but Ethan spoke before I could respond. And something inside me was broken by what he said. "Mom, it's all right. The kitchen is hers to eat in." "That's probably preferable." He avoided looking at me. He didn't even express embarrassment. He spoke as though he thought it was true, as if I wasn't worthy of sitting next to him, as if I weren't related to him. Something in me froze. I carefully made my way past the uneasy silence and whispers to the kitchen, where I took a seat on the stool facing away from the dining room. Despite the fire crackling behind me, my hands felt cold once more. I didn't even take a bite. As Ethan browsed through his phone on the couch, I gazed at my dish, the glossy glaze of the ham I had assisted in cooking, and the potatoes I had mashed the previous evening. I had put a lot of effort into making this holiday memorable, including baking his mother's favorite pie from scratch, ironing his shirt that morning, and carefully selecting gifts. And now, like a kid banished to the corner, I was eating by myself. That night, something softly broke inside of me. I didn't cry, though. Not quite yet. I just sat there and broke softly. And I asked myself, why do I continue to strive to fit in with a place that consistently tells me I don't? Because there was something unusual about this moment. This time, every snub, cold shoulder, and insult disguised as a joke had been accepted by me. It wasn't simply another jab, though. It was a rejection, public, intentional, and from the man I believed to be my lover. I didn't say anything during supper. However, they weren't used to my silence. It wasn't a subservient one. It was a premonition-like feeling, because I made a decision I had never made before that night, while sitting on that kitchen stool as though I didn't belong. I was finished. However, they were unaware of my next course of action. You would have to go back a few years to fully comprehend the significance of that Christmas night for me. I missed the time when I thought that if you worked hard enough, you might earn love. I met Ethan in college. He exuded charisma, self-assurance, and effortless popularity. I was the quiet one who stayed late to clean up after study groups. During finals week, I was the girl who cooked cookies and remembered everyone's birthdays. She was the type of girl who never occupied a lot of room. That's what he liked about me, he once told me. He said, "You're not like the others. You are not the center of attention." I took it as a compliment at the time. He didn't rely on a grand gesture or an expensive diamond to propose. He said, "We've been together long enough when we were having dinner in our small apartment. Let's just get it done." Yes, I replied, since I cherished him. I believed that he loved me in his own quiet way, because I believed that love might exist without pyrotechnics. In retrospect, I question whether I ever truly fit into his universe, or if I was simply practical. Our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple is something I recall. When I brought a handmade apple pie to his mother's house, she opened the door, gave me a quick glance, and remarked, "You look tired. I hope that wasn't baked by you." It hurt. However, I dismissed it with a laugh. Then came Christmas Eve, when she gave each person a personalized present, such as ancestral jewelry, framed family photos, or scarves embroidered with their initials. Mine was a clearance store candle when I opened it. There was no label, no tag. When I opened it, she didn't even give me a look. Perhaps I was overreacting, I thought. Perhaps I wasn't making enough of an effort. So I stepped up. I offered to host Easter, prepared the entire meal, laid out the table with adorable pastel place cards, and even made sure she had a chair cushion because she had complained of back problems the previous month. She failed to show up. Ethan's sister, however, did. I brought mac and cheese from the store in a plastic container. It was the night's best meal according to Ethan. I said nothing whatsoever. I simply grinned and cleared the plates. I always did it that way, even though I wasn't invited when his family organized a trip. Even when Ethan would tag everyone but me in group images they posted online, I was told directly by his sister, "You know you'll never really be one of us, right?" I chuckled, claimed it was all right. I assured him that I understood. My secret fear was that if I complained or defended myself, he would leave. I also didn't want to be abandoned once more. I never knew my true parents, you see. My family adopted me when I was 3 years old. Despite the kindness of my family, I always felt like a guest in someone else's house, as if I had borrowed time to be there. I thought, maybe this is it. When Ethan picked me, perhaps I will be able to fit in at last. I made every effort to meet his needs, prepared his favorite dishes. After losing his job, he took on additional shifts. He paid half the rent when he was between things. I also used the money I had been saving for a writing retreat I had wanted since college to give him the down payment when he wanted to buy a new automobile. He never expressed gratitude. I didn't beg him to either. The night I told him I had a short story published, however, was what truly devastated me and is still on my mind in private. It was my first actual publication. Yes, it was a small magazine, but it was mine. I felt pleased. "Cool," he responded, looking up from his phone and shrugging. However, it's important to maintain realistic expectations. There is no compensation for writers. He then switched the television back on. I dismissed it with a giggle. I did, of course. That's what you do when someone undermines your confidence, one little remark at a time. You act as though there is no pain. You learn to swallow disappointment like a pro. Your heart is quietly bruising as you grin. I wasn't shocked when Dad instructed me to sit in the kitchen like a stray dog looking for leftovers at Christmas that year. Not at all. It had long been anticipated. What was unexpected, though, was me, because that night, something changed in me. I no longer desired inclusion. I desired to leave. And I began to think about what it could be like to cease striving for approval for the first time in years. Must quit pleading for room in a room that I assisted in creating, to at last get up and leave. As I emptied my untouched plate, I reminded myself that I had been silent for too long. However, I won't be silent for long, because I wasn't going to act like it didn't hurt this time. Furthermore, I refused to let them get away with it. I got up earlier than Ethan the morning after Christmas. I listened to his gentle snore while I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. The pale, icy light that came through the drapes was the kind that made everything seem too motionless. I have no idea why I was waiting. Was it an expression of regret? An epiphany? A tiny indication that he recognized what he had done the previous evening? It never materialized. He kissed my forehead, asked if I could prepare pancakes, and stretched as if it were any other day when he finally woke up. And I did! However, while I stood at the stove mixing batter and whisking eggs, my hands worked automatically while my thoughts were elsewhere. It was no longer melancholy. The rage was subdued, the kind that was establishing roots beneath the surface, rather than pleading to be heard or seen. I refrained from screaming. I refrained from crying. I just sat across from him, served the pancakes, and gazed at the man I believed to be familiar. His mother called that afternoon. He laughed into the phone as I listened from the hallway. "She's all right," he said. "During the holidays, she always becomes emotional. You are aware of her personality." In that statement, I had no idea who she was. However, I understood he wasn't referring to a specific individual. He was discussing a part, a hassle, a woman who was too simple to ignore, and something hardened within me. I declined his sister's next phone, asking if I could watch her twins while she went to the spa. As simple as that. No, it hovered like smoke between us. She awaited my explanation, my apology, my laughter, and my admission that I was kidding. However, I didn't. I let the quiet speak for itself. "All right," she finally said in a harsher voice. Whoa. Click. It was odd. Even alien, but liberating. After years of whispering, it's like tasting your own voice. I didn't say no when Ethan asked me to recommend him to my friend's employer later that week, because I knew someone there and he needed a job. I remained silent. Twice he reminded me. I didn't mention it. He fell silent. Far away. I didn't pursue him, though. That was novel. I began going for walks in the evenings. I would take long, meandering walks around the neighborhood without any specific direction. Gazing into the cozy windows of other people's houses, I used to wonder what it would be like to experience unconditional love, not performing. I purchased a brand new journal. The first page just said, "Things for which I will no longer provide an apology." I began a list underneath it. Desiring to be noticed, desiring to be treated with kindness, I want to celebrate my victories. Desiring room, desiring quiet. I started writing every day, not because it would be read. However, I needed to recall the sound of my own voice when no one else was around to speak over it. When I returned home from one of my walks a few evenings later, I discovered Ethan in the living room, sipping beer and browsing through his phone. "Where have you been?" he questioned without raising his gaze. "Out. Who is it with?" "Only me." He gave me a brief look but remained silent. He didn't inquire how I was doing. He didn't inquire as to why I appeared. Odd. I came to the realization that he had lost interest in me at that point. Perhaps he had never been. I became aware of the small details. He frequently interrupted me during our chats. When I corrected him, he sighed. He only touched me when he needed consolation, not when I needed comfort. How I was only the shadow they allowed to accompany his family, who had turned into his shield. He asked me what was wrong one evening as we were watching a movie on the couch. "Do you believe I belong in your family?" I asked him, staring him in the eye. He hesitated, blinked. He moved in his chair. "What sort of inquiry is that? Simply respond to it." He let out a frustrated groan. "They're not used to folks like you, really." "Do people like me?" He gestured with his hand. "You understand what I mean." "Sensitive. Too grave. Everything is personal to you." I gave a nod, silently. And I opened my laptop that night as he was sleeping next to me. I went looking. Attorneys, apartments, freelance editing positions, composing residencies. I used to tell myself that some things would come later. However, they were now objects. No matter how long I had been silent, it made no difference. The fact that I was at last beginning to move was what counted. I also wrote him a note in the middle of the night. Not to go. Not quite yet. However, just this. Soon, I will no longer have to explain myself. You'll come to the realization that I never needed to change when I do. I folded it. I slipped it in my notebook. And for the first time in weeks, I grinned. I didn't have a plan, but because I was able to make one without his consent for the first time, I didn't decide to leave one day when I woke up. It would have been too simple, too tidy. For women like me, there is rarely a tidy way out of life. Rather, the first started to stray first intellectually, then emotionally, and lastly, sexually. Ethan was completely unaware. He talked about himself too much. His job search, his dissatisfaction with the state of the economy, and the fact that his mother, who detested my decorating style, insisted that we host Easter this year. As I silently put a box of books in the guest room, he said all of this. I introduced myself as a declutterer. He looked up from his phone just enough to nod. It was simpler to vanish the more invisible I got. At work, I exerted some influence. My coworker Jonah, whom I had previously assisted during his job search, was now leading a small content team at an upstate media startup. 3 months prior, he had made me an offer of employment. At the time, I had graciously rejected. Right now, I returned his call. I tried to speak steadily as I told him, I considered what you said. If the job is still available, it is, he answered at once. And if you want it, you can have it. We discussed logistics. We arranged for a small package to be transported. The package contained a temporary place for me to stay while I searched for a permanent solution. A fresh beginning. I answered yes a week later, but I didn't say anything to Ethan. I began discreetly transferring funds into an account that was solely associated with my name. It was just enough to pay for a secondhand automobile, a deposit, and the first month's rent. Driving returned to me like muscle memory, even though I hadn't done it in years. I would occasionally drive to a tiny cafe 2 towns over just to sit quietly. I informed Ethan that I had a late shift. He never requested evidence. I looked for divorce attorneys at night, not to make a call just yet, but to find out who was out there. I was looking for names, tales, assessments. I was no longer acting on feelings. This was a tactic. I went to the pharmacy one day to get a prescription refill. The pharmacist inquired as to whether Ethan was still my emergency contact. I paused. No, I answered softly. Can we take him out? She said softly. Of course. And I let out a breath that felt like it had been years. Ethan's sister celebrated her daughter's birthday that weekend. She didn't invite me. Once more. It's just easier if you don't come, Ethan replied. You are aware of how your presence affects Mom. I gave a nod. After that, I bought a vintage suitcase for myself from a secondhand store and put it in the back of my closet. I refrained from crying. I avoided confrontation. I simply got ready. Ethan wanted me to contact his mother one evening while we were sitting on the couch to express gratitude for the holiday gift basket. He said, You know she meant well. My name was not even written on the card by her. He blinked. Once more, you're displaying sensitivity. It was there. I got to my feet. I'll be taking a bath. Aren't you furious once more? I didn't respond. I simply slid into the water, shut the door, and allowed the silence to envelop me. Like a promise, not a punishment. Thereafter, I covered myself with a towel and gazed at myself in the mirror. I painstakingly traced my reflection, as if I were finding someone I had long forgotten. Someone once had boundaries, fire guidance. I informed Jonah via text that evening that I would be arriving the first week of March. In response, he said, We'll be prepared. If you need assistance moving, please let me know. That made me smile. It had been a while since someone had offered to help me without expecting anything in return. A few days later, I loaded several suitcases into my car while Ethan was out on errands. Only clothing. I have a couple of books with me, my notebook. In between Spotify tunes and washing cycles, I worked slowly and leisurely. I was folding towels as if nothing had happened when he came back. However, everything had. I stood in our living room one afternoon, looking around the place I used to decorate so meticulously, only to have his mother dismiss it as too minimalist, his sister as too modern, and Ethan as too costly. I had cherished this house. However, it had never returned my love. I didn't speak anything at supper that evening. What's new? Ethan asked. Not much, I responded. He was never aware of my composure. How it was settled. Not because I was at peace, but because I had stopped justifying my value to others who didn't want to see it. The tempest inside of me had finally subsided. I called a lawyer a week later. I then gave Jonah a call. I then gave myself a name I hadn't used in a while, Free. I hadn't told Ethan yet. I didn't have to, though. Not all storms make an announcement. They simply appear. I recall the morning when everything fell apart. It was a Tuesday. Wet, overcast, and completely unremarkable to everybody but me. Ethan sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee absently and browsing through his phone. Half hidden behind the doorframe, I observed him from the hallway. The man who used to write me post-it notes when I was younger and who I used to wait for at train stations didn't even look up as I entered the room. And still, I felt completely at ease that morning. Not affection, not hatred, nothing but silence. I said, "I'm going out for a bit," he replied with a grunt. "Get some almond milk. We're leaving." I gazed at him. The man told me I didn't belong there. The man informed me that his family should not be seated with me. I believed it would be easier if I didn't attend his gatherings. That I caused awkwardness. The reason for this is because I never fit into the family he created, which is refined on the exterior but subtly nasty on the inside. I gave a nod. After that, I left via the front door and never returned. I had already packed my car. I left everything else behind. The furnishings. The album contains photos from the wedding. His mother used to say that I looked too simple in winter clothes. I took my paperwork, my laptop, my dignity, and a duffel bag. Jonah helped me rent a new apartment, and I drove 6 hours to get there. It was tidy but compact. I adored every square inch of the third-floor walk-up, even with its chipped windowsills and creaking floors. I owned it. I gave my lawyer a call the following morning. "Is it time?" she inquired. "Yes," I replied. She put the documents in the file. She did this quietly and strategically. We made no alimony requests. I had no desire for a dime. All I wanted was serenity. I banned Ethan's number that night. His first 3 voicemails were unanswered by me, or the 5 texts, or "What the hell is going on with the email?" I didn't read it. After that, his sister called. "You left him behind? Like that? Considering all that he has done for you?" I wanted to chuckle. All that he has done for me? You're referring to the Christmas when I was prohibited from sitting at the table? Or the years he spent saying he was sorry I was there? She stopped talking. I ended the call. I wrote a letter to Ethan's mother the following day instead of to him. I scribbled inside, "I appreciate you pointing out that I didn't belong. I might have stayed longer than I should have if it weren't for you. No address for return." Nothing but quiet. Ethan wasn't finished, though. 2 weeks later, he arrived at my new home one evening. The door was not opened by me. Through the peephole, I observed him. He appeared unshaven and slimmer. After knocking 3 times, he yelled, "Talk to me, Ava, please." I said nothing. The line that pushed it over the edge then appeared. "All I want to know is what's making you so upset." He failed to understand. He didn't. There wasn't a Christmas. There was more than one meal or time spent at the table. It was the gradual decline in one's sense of value. Subtle humiliations defined the experience. The ongoing reduction in size. How I wasn't loved, but rather tolerated. I stood with him for a long time. A copy of the divorce papers was then slipped under the door. He took it up. A tiny gasp reached my ears. Then, disappearing down the stairs, footsteps. I didn't see him again after that. The following day, I gave Jonah a call. "Are you all right?" he inquired. I stopped. "Slowly," I said. "I believe I am." That night, he stopped by with a bottle of wine and some Chinese takeaway. We didn't discuss Ethan. All we did was laugh, eaten dumplings, told each other college stories. He once commented, "You know, I never liked how he talked to you," after glancing at me. I blinked. You remained silent. He gave a shrug. I didn't believe I belonged there. However, I did see it. Everyone did. I cried that night, but it was comfort rather than anguish. Someone had observed. I had been spotted. And that assured me I hadn't dreamed it more than anything else. I hadn't overstated. I hadn't been overly emotional, overly sensitive, or very challenging. Simply put, I had been mistreated. I had finally come to terms with that. 2 months later, the divorce was finalized. He didn't argue. No major scene was made. There was no altercation in the courtroom. All that was required was a signature. A final farewell to a phase of my life that I had outgrown. Additionally, a young boy raced past me one day while holding his father's hand while I was strolling down the street. He was giggling uncontrollably. I grinned, not because I desired children, but because at last I felt like one light, burden-free. and ready to sprint in the direction of whatever was ahead. I had no idea what it would be. However, I was aware that I would be facing it alone, and there was no reason to be afraid of that anymore. It was something to treasure. I once believed that the most difficult thing would be leaving, that I would be broken if I said enough and left a house full of memories, a man I once loved, and a version of myself that put forth too much effort for too little. However, I wasn't broken by the leaving. It was the result, the quiet, the room, the lonely mornings when I was alone and didn't have somebody to make coffee for, fix their shirt, or receive a text telling me to be extra courteous around his mother. Only me. Me and the burden of all that I had gone through. There were several minor triumphs within the first week following the divorce. For the counter in my kitchen, I purchased fresh flowers. I enrolled in a class on pottery. I let the breeze flow through all the rooms by opening the windows wide. At night, however, the silence enveloped me like a mist. Was it really that bad? I would ask myself as I lay awake. Was I being overly sensitive? Was I too quick to give up? Then I would recall Christmas. His expression when he stated, "Ava, you make things uncomfortable. This time, perhaps just take a seat in the back." How nobody stood up for me, not even his sisters. How everyone else gathered around the long mahogany table, laughing, passing gifts, pouring wine, and acting as though I wasn't there, while I stood by the kitchen with my plate. It would be like a wave of those memories. The fog would then clear. I didn't give up too quickly. No. I lingered too long. I ran into Rachel, a former coworker, outside a bookshop one afternoon. Before the split, she had not seen me. When she spotted me, her eyes grew wide. "Wow," she exclaimed. "You appear strange. How is it different?" As if you had at last recalled your identity. Despite my lack of faith in her, I grinned. That was something I was still working out. We had coffee. I told her everything, or nearly everything. She listened, nodded, and simply showed up without showing sympathy. "I hope you give yourself the same grace you gave him for all those years," she murmured, squeezing my hand as we said our goodbyes. I remembered that sentence, since she was correct. Ethan's dismissiveness, allowing his mother to talk down to me, forgetting anniversaries, and shutting me out of his life for all things I had forgiven 100 times. I had never, however, forgiven myself for allowing it to occur. I therefore began therapy. I needed to know why I had allowed myself to remain so little, not because I was damaged. During our first session, my therapist, Carla, who is a gentle person, said something that will always stick in my memory. Proving your value to those who have wronged you doesn't help you heal. By recalling it yourself, you recover. I then started to rebuild, not with ostentatious displays, but with minor items. I began to walk every morning, just listening to my breath without any headphones. I started preparing dinners for one with the same attention to detail that I used to save for special occasions: fresh herbs, wine reductions, and roasted veggies. I ceased to monitor Ethan's social media accounts. I ceased to wonder if he had taken my position. I gave up waiting for an unattainable apology. Rather, I provided myself with the resolution he never provided. However, life tends to circle back. Ethan texted me about 3 months after I moved out. One sentence only: "You are missed." I gazed at it, not with want, but clearly, since I was aware of what he truly missed. The version of me that made his life easy was the one he missed. It was Ava who made things easier. When it wasn't, who said it was okay? Who, despite his family giving me nothing, gave them the benefit of the doubt? I didn't answer. His mother sent me an email a week later. "We had no intention of hurting you. You are aware that you will always be a member of this family." I burst out laughing. I also didn't respond to that one. Because, in all honesty, I was never really a member of their family. Not at all. I served as a stand-in, a prop, something easy to conceal at Christmas and flaunt at brunches. And they wanted to change the tale now that I was no longer convenient. But my ending was already scripted, and they were left out. Rather, the first gradually encountered people who saw me as Ava, not as a continuation of someone else. The cafe barista was able to recall my order. "You have the most grounded energy," observed the yoga instructor. I was invited to a gaming night by my downstairs neighbor. Little things, commonplace acts of compassion. However, they added up to something fresh, to a life that was no longer focused on winning over people who only showed conditional affection. I received a text from Rachel one day asking whether I would want to join a book club. I nearly declined. I was still rebuilding, still raw. I did, however, say yes. And while I listened to ladies laugh, weep, and talk in a living room filled with mismatched furniture and partially consumed snacks, I experienced a feeling I hadn't had in years. A sense of belonging, not coerced, not pleaded for, simply put, real. I grinned to myself as I made my way home that evening in a light rain. I didn't consider Ethan. His family was not on my mind. I didn't consider everything I had lost. Even though it took time, I considered the silent satisfaction of restoring something sincere. I reflected on my progress. Additionally, I wasn't bearing the burden of being uninvited for the first time. Freedom was in my possession, the kind that results from making your own decisions. I still occasionally see them. Not too often, not voluntarily. The town is small. We run into each other at the grocery store, the bank parking lot, and even at a community benefit. Ethan always has the same appearance, shiny on the outside and hollow underneath. Margaret, his mother, still smiles tightly and artificially as if it were a piece of clothing. She gives me the type of nod you save for people you used to know too well if we look at each other. However, I no longer feel angry. Not as it was, I don't feel anything. Furthermore, there is no such thing as freedom. I would have done everything a year ago to get their attention. I can see myself now, and that's more than sufficient. Now my life, it is more silent, easier. However, it was full of the kind of warmth I never imagined finding outside of a family table. I lease a little cottage close to the lake. It needs updating in the kitchen. The flooring is uneven, and the steps are creaky, but it's mine. I picked every picture on the wall. Each book on the bookcase reflects who I am, not the person I was attempting to be for other people. Instead of strain, I wake up to the sound of birds. I'm barefoot on the porch, sipping my coffee slowly, and I'm not in a rush to make sure everything is ideal for a man who hardly looked up from his phone. People the first spend time with don't need an explanation of who I am. Those who inquire about my well-being and pay attention to my response. I don't shrink for people who want to feel taller. Rachel comes by frequently. Sometimes, like ancient souls at last taking a nap, we sit by the fireplace and read for hours without saying anything. At other times, our laughter makes my stomach ache. I was unaware of how long it had been since I had laughed without self-consciousness, without checking to make sure I wasn't being too much. I never imagined falling in love again. To be honest, I didn't intend to. However, love finds you in an odd manner when you're not trying to win it. Daniel is his name. He and I met at a nearby bookstore. He stood before the poetry area, unable to decide between Rumi and Mary Oliver. He smiled and remarked, "A woman after my own heart," when I advised him to purchase both. He didn't use grand gestures to impress me. He greeted me with patience, honesty, and the kind of generosity that doesn't demand anything in return. He didn't recoil when I told him everything, even the marriage, Christmas, and the words that occasionally still rang in his ears. "You didn't deserve any of that," he said. "However, I'm happy you're here now." That was it. No repairing, no saving, just understanding. I still think about that Christmas dinner sometimes. I was requested to sit in the back of that one. I wonder what would have occurred if I had kept silent, told myself it wasn't a big thing, and smiled like I always did. Perhaps I would still be there, hiding behind a mask and destroying myself one concession at a time. However, I didn't. I left. I walked back inside myself in the process. When I stopped pleading to fit in and began creating a life where I already did, that Christmas turned into the turning point. Not by blood, not typically, however, by truth. I don't think Ethan will apologize. Neither will he apologize to his mother or from anybody who made me feel inadequate. To be honest, I no longer require one. They never found closure, but I did. The goal of forgiveness is not to absolve them. It's about letting go of the burden of waiting. I no longer hold shame or rage or the pain of being passed over. I bring tranquility, comfort in the knowledge that I now select myself. Each day, each season, each and every Christmas. I'm throwing my own Christmas dinner this year, not very fancy. Mismatched dishes, too many desserts, a cozy fire, a few pals, and laughter that overflows like wine. Everybody at the table will share something for which they are thankful. And I'll say this when it's my turn: I'm glad I was informed that I wasn't worthy of a seat, because I learned how to construct my own table from it, one in which there is room for everyone, in particular myself, particularly the me that used to be too shy to talk, too eager to please, and too desperate to fit in. Now she has a place at the table's head, with fire in her spine and grace in her hands, and nobody can ever take that away from her again, not even Margaret or Ethan. I can relate if you've ever felt alienated in your own narrative. You don't cause trouble. You're not too much. You're not undeserving. Additionally, you deserve to be seated at a table where love is unconditional. Make your own decision, even in the absence of them. Particularly at that time,